Happy Wednesday, everyone, and welcome to our Portage webinar for this week on Certify Your Data Repository, Get the Support of a Cohort. My name is Jennifer Abel, and I am the training coordinator for the Portage Network. And I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh. In today's webinar, we're going to be having an introduction to the CoreTrustSeal Repository Certification Support Cohort and Funding Project. Portage will soon be launching, in fact has just launched, a call for applications to participate in a cohort of Canadian repositories working towards CoreTrustSeal certification, together with funding to support this effort on the part of each participating repository. In this webinar, we'll provide an overview of the benefits of working toward repository certification alongside a cohort and discuss some of the factors that contribute to success. We'll also provide a brief introduction to CoreTrustSeal as a certification for sustainable and trustworthy repositories and discuss the certification process from the perspective of Ocean Networks Canada, a Canadian repository. Finally, we'll introduce the call for applications for participation in Portage's cohort of repositories. And this webinar will be especially relevant for you if you are considering applying to join this cohort. A few housekeeping notes before we get started. You've been muted automatically when you entered the room. This webinar is being recorded and the chat may be archived for those who are unable to attend. We encourage you to use the latest versions. You have access to all of the features, including security updates. Please use the chat feature if you're having technical difficulties or if you have additional resources to share. And please use the Q&A option to ask questions of the presenters. Questions will be addressed at the end of the session. You can also raise your hand if you wish to ask a question, and questions may be asked in English or French. We do have a code of conduct that we follow here in our Portage webinars, which you can find at the link on the screen or in the chat. Carl and the Portage Network are committed to providing a welcoming, safe, and harassment-free environment for its staff, membership, committees, and working groups, as well as for participants, speakers, and organizers of Carl meetings and events. We do not tolerate harassment of any kind. And our presenters today, not quite in the order that we have on the slide. We're going to be starting off with Rebecca Koskela, who is the Executive Director of Research Data Alliance US. Then we're going to hear from Raina Jenkins, who's the Data Stewardship Manager from Ocean Networks Canada. And then finally, but certainly not least, Corinne Berger, who is the Project Officer with the Portage Network. So Rebecca, as our leadoff batter, you have the floor.
Thank you. And you want to put up my slide? Oh, my slides?
Yep.
Oh, thank you very much.
And just let me 1 second here. Oops. All right. We'll probably have to do it like this, but that's okay.
Oh, that's fine. Okay, so thank you for the opportunity to tell you all about another cohort that was formed for CoreTrustSeal. And this was formed 2 years ago. Next slide. So the cohort was formed as part of the Enabling Fair Data project that was led by the American Geophysical Union, and they had some funding in order to work with both publishers and data repositories. And what they wanted to do is to make sure that data repositories were fair aligned in order to add value to the existing research data, to provide metadata and landing pages to make it easy to discover those data, and also to help the researchers with the way to document their data, how to cite it, and curation. And with the fair aligned Earth, space, and environmental science publishers, they wanted to make sure it was easier for those who are submitting papers that have to have their data sets in a repository to have the publishers asking for similar things and not having to do different things for each different publisher. Next one. So what we did towards the end of that project, we put together the CoreTrustSeal Earth, Space, and Environmental Science, or ESSE's repository cohort. And the idea behind this was to have the different Earth, Space, and Environmental Science repositories come together as a cohort so that they could help and support each other when they were applying for CoreTrustSeal certification. And the idea was that CoreTrustSeal certification acts as a proxy for fair data. And in the US, projects that are funded by the National Science Foundation and the NIH, the National Institute of Health, have a better way of maintaining their funding if they are CoreTrustSeal certified. So this was to be a big help for them. And one of the ways that we help them out is that we had enough funding to pay for their application fee when they were ready to submit. So I want to tell you a little bit about how we manage this cohort. Next slide. And okay, so I told you why we did it. So we have actually 3 years in order to accomplish this. So in order to be part of the cohort, you get help preparing your application for certification. But in order to have that application fee covered, it needs to be submitted within 3 years of the start. So the end date for us is going to be February of next year, 2020. Next slide. So when I was asked to lead the cohort, I agreed, but I actually thought I was going to have to search and really convince repositories to get involved. But when I sent out the email, I was really surprised at the responses. I got over 12 responses right away, and we're up to 20. And the nice thing about this cohort is the funding doesn't restrict it to just the US, so that people from around the world, it can be a global cohort, which is really nice. And what we've done so far is to present webinars, actually much like this one, is to give a background on CoreTrustSeal. We did webinars, and these are all available on the CoreTrustSeal website if you ever want to look at them. But we also had webinars from the people that had gone through it, and they presented why they did it, what they thought the advantages were, and lessons learned from that. In addition, in the US, there's a National Science Foundation funded project called EarthCube, and they have a council of data facilities, which are repositories that work together. And we've been working, a lot of the people in the cohort are repository managers from this, and we work together with them. The other way that we worked with the cohort was that we had sessions at meetings that they were already going to be at. So one was the American Geophysical Union, AGU, that was sponsoring it, but also the European Geophysical Union meeting that's usually held in April. There's another group in the US called Earth Science Information Partners, or ESIP, and we presented there and actually had sessions at their meetings. And we've also presented at the Research Data Alliance plenary. So these are different ways to get the word out. We have a mailing list that people can subscribe to, and the idea is for the people in the cohort to ask each other questions. Next one. So like I said, yeah, we're up to 25 repositories now. So there was a lot of interest in joining the cohort. Really good attendance at the webinars. All of them were recorded. So if people couldn't make them, they could watch them later. Waiver for the application fee turned out to be really important, especially now. Some of them already had CoreTrustSeal, but they needed to recertify, but didn't have enough money to pay the application fee. And for some countries in Europe. This was actually, it was in Russia that was a problem, and we were able to help them out. And so far, the Research Data Archive, which was the very first one to certify, and they had theirs ready to go. So they were like the leader in the cohort, and they submitted theirs within a month. Next was the Arctic Data Center, which holds Arctic data that is funded by the National Science Foundation. Then the next one was the BICO-DEMO, which is biological and chemical oceanography data management. And the next one was the Seismology Data Center, IRIS, sorry. And they were certified. And then the one in Russia is the ISO-ARC, Open Access and Collaborative Isotope Database for bioarchaeological samples, and they have submitted with the help of having that application fee covered. Next one. So I think lessons learned, or the challenges and the way to keep a cohort together is it's important to have ongoing communications and just to reach out to them and keep in touch. We found out that if you have a project manager or somebody actually shepherding the project at the repository, it seems to work better. Some had to get the CoreTrustSeal certification in order to keep their funding. And one of them, IRIS, actually hired a contractor in order to help them with the process. So there were different ways that people have gone about this. And I found that pairing up repositories that are starting a process with one that have just completed so they can really help each other out is one way to go. It's not the only way, but it's a helpful way to go. Next one, and I think that was it. Okay, yeah, that's all for me.
Great, thanks so much, Rebecca. So now we are over to Raina.
Okay, I accidentally closed my link, so I just have to get it back up. Oh, there it is. Okay. Share my screen. Okay. So thank you all for joining. So I'm going to give you a little bit of overview about the CoreTrustSeal and a little tiny bit at the end about the ONC perspective about that. And so just to start off, I just want to remind you about the trust principles. Now, I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail here, but there is the webinar that was recorded in the fall about the trust principles in more detail. But just to remind you about the principles, and this is what we're really aspiring to when we go about these certification processes. So these concepts like transparency, responsibility, user focus, sustainability, and technology. And so the history of the CoreTrustSeal came from originally there used to be the data seal of approval and the World Data System, which still exists. And they had different certification requirements. Those were melded together through a series of, through an RDA working group into a common set of requirements, and then out emerged the CoreTrustSeal. And then the data seal of approval no longer exists, but the World Data System still exists and is using the CoreTrustSeal requirements as the certification element to being a member. Then we have this image on the right, crediting Wim Hugo here, and it just kind of outlines, like at the outer edge of this circle, you have sort of this aspirations, you have all your principles, your fair, your trust, your care. And then as you go inward, it becomes like more towards your implementations. And sort of this CoreTrustSeal is kind of providing that means towards getting to those aspirations of those principles, whereas the individual repository implementations are sort of at that center. So you can kind of think about it that way. It's like the way of stepping to those goals. So the CoreTrustSeal, once you are certified, it lasts for 3 years, and then it's expected that you would renew if you would like to continue being certified. There are 16 requirements, and these are self-assessed through the form, and ultimately it's peer-reviewed by other reviewers that already have certification. These applications, once they are completed and accepted, become publicly available. So this is a huge resource for when you're actually thinking about submitting your own content, because then you have all this wealth of information to look at. There is that fee, but of course, yeah, these sort of cohort opportunities help to mitigate that. That fee isn't really a way for CoreTrustSeal to make money. It's a way to cover the basic admin costs. And so all the board members and these reviewers, none of them are paid directly for their work. So just keep that in mind. Each requirement is sort of graded between 0 and 4, where 0 is not applicable. And that's rarely the case, but it's an option. And then 1 to 4, whether you've considered it, is theoretical in your mind about how you're going to go about it, whether you're implementing it, and whether it's fully implemented. So the requirements, they need to be met at the level of 3 or 4 in order to actually get that certification ultimately. So, and then if you had a 3 in one application 1 year, maybe 3 years later, you'd actually have moved that to 4. So just to quickly do an overview of the requirements, there's 16, and they're broken down into these 3 areas of the organizational structure, the digital object management, and the technology. And so on the right, I've just given just an example of how the requirements look. So you have this requirement 7, which is about the data integrity and authenticity. And so for each requirement, there's this compliance level. There's a guidance about what is meant by that. So what you need to explain in your response. And for each response, you can also have supporting evidence. So you might have links or ancillary documents that go into more detail, like your policies or process documentation that you might have available to dive into detail. I also really recommend not just looking at the basic requirement document, but also there's an extended requirements document. And this really emerged to help reviewers, first of all, to help them understand how to assess the applicants. But I think it's also really useful when you're writing to take a look at that, because then you can have a better idea of how the answers are going to be assessed. So I definitely recommend looking at that extended guidance. And this is just an example, the shortest one that I could fit on a slide and still be readable. But basically you can see like the extended guidance just give us a little bit more explanation about what the CoreTrustSeal is looking for. Just in terms of clarifications that sometimes come up. So with the CoreTrustSeal, and I know that we specifically mentioned French here because of expecting that hopefully some repositories, maybe in Quebec or other French repositories in Canada might be interested, or other languages too. But basically, there is no official translated requirements documents. There is an unofficial one that was created a couple of years ago. But I think the court, through this process, maybe there'd be more emphasis on trying to help with that translation. Maybe not as an official resource, but definitely one to help you through. And then, but the applications themselves, they do have to be responded to in English. There might be supporting evidence like the data policy or other institutional documents that are not in English, and that's okay as long as they can be summarized in English for that response. And I think it will be talked about a bit later, but through the cohort, there will be some support for these translation type activities. In terms of the review, so basically what happens is once you've submitted your application into the CoreTrustSeal, there will be 2 reviewers that will take a look at all your answers, and they will first assess, is that number like the 3 or the 4 that you've ranked your repository, is that making sense to them? And is your answer fully accounting for that requirement? And so they'll go through that all and they'll make their comments. And then once that's done by the 2 reviewers, the board at regular meetings, they'll go through all those submissions that have had the 2 reviews done. and they'll just look for consistency. And sometimes there might be additional discussion depending on the answers that were given, and some discussion. But ultimately that'll be sent back with some feedback to the candidate. In some cases, there's an immediate award of that certification, but sometimes it might take multiple iterations, which is fine. So there is a maximum amount of times that you can resubmit, but in any case, it can go back a few times, and that's not anything to be ashamed of. It's sometimes just getting clarity or needing to add more documentation, or sometimes the answers, maybe some of the answers are putting content in maybe the wrong place or something like that. So I wouldn't take that as a negative thing. It just might take a couple cycles. And then, yeah, ultimately, if the certification is awarded, they'll be notified, and that final application gets posted to be publicly available on the CoreTrustSeal website. So within the requirements, you'll find this wording of designated communities that you are asked to describe for your repository. And so I've just taken that direct text here. So basically, you need to describe clearly what is the designated community of the repository. And sometimes there's a possibility to have this idea of multiple sub-communities. So it doesn't have to be just one domain or one community. You can have multiple, but as long as that's clearly specified and identified, and then throughout the application, the answers will be should be tailored in a way that sort of emphasizes that the community needs are met, whether it's through the community-based standards or expectations in the way that the repository executes its services. There is an active effort at the CoreTrustSeal to open up the certification process up to more generalist and technical repository service providers. That community consultation happened over the last year or so. And now the board is still going through just the final analyzing of all those results, and hopefully something will come out sometime in the near term that's more formal. But at this point, this is what there is. So we do have now 104 repositories that have been certified internationally. It'd be nice to get some Canadian numbers as part of that. And I just note that we did have our 100th milestone in the fall, so that press release went out, and yeah, that was a very exciting moment to reach, and really not too long, so that's pretty good. Just a little feature that I want to point out. So with Re3 data, which is the repository of repositories, I suppose, you can find special features in there that will identify repositories that have the CoreTrustSeal with this red filled in circle. So there is that built in, and you can search and filter on CoreTrustSeal certified repositories. So that's an added benefit too, right? If you're certified, then if researchers or anyone that is trying to deposit their data in an appropriate repository, they might be looking for that, or that they might even be required to find that. So it's something to keep in mind if you're trying to make your repository more open, or as a means for others to find your repository and to want to submit their data with you. So there's a couple, I'm just highlighting a couple different related analysis items that are out there. There's others, but there's a couple that I'm flagging here. So Lisa Johnston recently put out, very recently, this data set that actually just takes all the applicants from 2017 to 2019 and just extracts. There's this one question in the questionnaire that asks you to say what kind of curation you're doing at your repository, at what level. And so this is just a summary of those repositories, and only one repository had content distributed as deposit, so basically zero curation really. And then which makes sense, to be certified, you'd expect more than that. And so the vast majority had the highest level of curation, this data level curation, where they're not just checking at the format level and documentation, but they're actually looking at more detail, maybe the values of the data, or going into a little bit more detail. So that just gives you an indication that that curation element is important, and that is an indicator there. But another way of looking at it is like, what value does it add to get certified to an individual repository? So there's just one case study here I give a link to, and they basically specified in the end when they did the assessment that the three greatest benefits for them in this one case was their stakeholder confidence, especially with funders, and that kind of aligns with what Rebecca was stating, as well as their improved and transparent documentation and process improvements. So that's something to think about, like it could bring, that it can bring to you. And there are other benefits they mentioned in the paper as well, but those were the three, the key ones that came out for them. So you're welcome to look at that. And if you're interested too, in not just like participating in the cohort, but also in being more active in the digital repository community, there is this Research Data Alliance WDS Certification of Digital Repositories Interest Group through the RDA, and I just give that link, and anyone that's interested can join. As well as they are running a session at the upcoming RDA plenary, that's in April. And so that just got posted or acknowledged or confirmed yesterday. So there's a link to the planned agenda for that. So it will be virtual, of course, and it'd be great to have more people from Canada participate in that. So just because I am from Ocean Networks Canada, just going to give our little 2 cents here. So we've been around now for 15 years, but we've been certified as a repository since 2014. Now that certification was under the World Data System, the old framework, and now we're actually working on our new application for the CoreTrustSeal. So that's in progress, and we hope to submit in the spring, early spring. But this has really been valuable for me personally, but also within the organization, just for like effectively communicating why we need to do certain things or which directions we need to go in, especially to maybe our board or executive who aren't necessarily coming from the data management angle, or our users, and they just need to have that, added confidence that it's coming from somewhere bigger. And also, it helps us motivate our major projects. So we did a Canary-funded project called Minted for making identifiers necessary for tracking evolving data, where we used dynamic data best practices to apply DOIs to our data sets. But this persistent identifier necessity kind of was partly motivated, of course, a good practice to do with our data as well, but also that data identification piece comes into the requirements of the CoreTrustSeal. So that helped motivate that project and get it off the ground. Certification has also helped us to just, to promote with our various stakeholders confidence in our capabilities without even necessarily having to really express too much about what we can do. If we can just say that's often enough. And then because the CoreTrustSeal is also tied to the World Data System, and we've been part of that, that also has been a great community for us to be a part of in sharing and disseminating ideas. So if you receive those CTS, you might also want to think about being a member of the World Data System as well. So that's all I had. So thank you.
Karine, you're up.
I am up, and I'm going to attempt to share my screen.
There you go.
Can you see my screen? Yes. Okay. Just one moment, because I don't see my controls. Does this work? Okay, good. All right, so I'm here on behalf of Portage, And as of April 1st, Andrea Portage. And I'm very, very pleased to finally be able to say that we have launched our call for applications for the Canadian, the first cohort of Canadian repositories working together to achieve or progress towards CoreTrustSeal certification. So I've spoken about this briefly before, but it's been a while. The broad purpose of this project is to advance FAIR principles for data, advance the trust principles for data repositories, support excellence in and strengthen confidence in Canadian repositories, and just support the research community more broadly. So the big idea of our project is that we really want to build capacity in the Canadian repository community. It's not just to take a given number of repositories and make sure they're certified. We're trying to sort of seed, build capacity, and build a network of repositories that is going to benefit everyone in the long run and pave the way for other repositories in the future to work towards certification. So we have spoken actually with projects, including Rebecca's, around the world. We've spoken with projects that are doing similar cohorts in the Netherlands, in France, in Australia as well. And so we're hoping to learn from them and leverage knowledge gains. We are also hoping to do training, have facilitated workshops, probably writing sessions, and then once we have the cohort assembled, hopefully we'll be able to learn about people's individual needs and maybe be responsive in terms of what we're able to coordinate and offer through the process. We have earmarked $10,000 per participating repository. That would include the €1,000 application fee, assuming the repository gets there. Eventually reaching the point of application is the goal. The funding will not be contingent actually applying, or at least not any portion beyond the application fee. We still haven't worked out all the details of that. I forgot to mention that this project is being overseen by Portage's Data Repositories Expert Group. So we have sort of a steering committee that is helping us shape this project as we move along. So just an overview of the application process. First, you want to ensure that your repository is eligible to apply for CoreTrustSeal certification. And what I mean by that is you need to, 1, be a data repository, and 2, you need to have direct responsibility for the stewardship and retention of data and metadata. So just if you meet those 2 basic requirements, please proceed. Then as part of the application, you will see that we have 5 sections. The main sections that are going to be work to fill out are the eligibility criteria section and the scoring criteria section. So the way we've envisioned this working is we have some eligibility criteria that are mandatory-ish. We have some scoring criteria that are going to be used by the selection committee, which will be composed of members of the Data Repository Expert Group, to assign scores and help us determine who will be selected, who will be offered places as part of the cohort. And then if we need to, we have a section for additional considerations that will just, if we're really stuck and the scoring is really close and we're having trouble deciding, we may look at the regional distribution of repositories. We may look at disciplinary coverage with the goal of ensuring that we have a broad range of disciplines covered. We might also look at including repositories who have achieved certification before. So with the idea that repositories that have experience in achieving certification will be a resource to other members of the cohort. So, so that would be a last step. So I'm going to go through the eligibility criteria and the scoring criteria in a little bit more detail, and then we'll have some time for questions. So our eligibility criteria. I'm going to say these are mandatory-ish criteria. So, so if you're hesitating on whether you meet these criteria, please don't self-select out, contact us, but I'm going to go through them. So first, you need to be a Canadian repository, and we're defining that for now as a repository that is affiliated with a Canadian institution or that is significantly managed and operated in Canada. If you have questions about that, contact us. You should have a mission that includes the stewardship and retention of data. If it's not formally in your mission statement at this point, but it's an important function or an important goal of the repository, don't self-select out, move forward with the application. You should have identified a designated community. You don't necessarily have to, at this point, have to have done that in the detail that is outlined to meet the requirement within the CoreTrustSeal requirements. But you should have identified a designated community. And as Reina was mentioning, it doesn't have to be necessarily a single unified designated community. It can be multiple communities. It can be an overarching community with subcommunities, but you should have identified a community that you serve. And you should provide or intend to provide, be committed to eventually providing curation, sort of curation of data. And as Reina mentioned, there are different, I think you mentioned, there are different levels of curation possible, and not all the data in your repository needs to be curated at the same level, but there should be some sort of curation activity happening or planned. Next, the scoring criteria. So these will be a little bit more flexible, and as I said, they're going to be used to assign a score to the application. So our first criteria here is evidence of clear senior management commitment to CoreTrustSeal certification. So we wanted the idea behind this criteria is that we wanted a criteria that would ensure that the repository was committed to this project for the duration and committed to the process, and had and would have, you know, resources committed towards working towards this and achieving CoreTrustSeal certification if possible. So we figured the best way to get at that would be to have evidence of senior management commitment to the process. It says here to CoreTrustSeal certification. We could say to progressing towards CoreTrustSeal certification. As long as there is evidence that your organization is committed to progressing, then yeah, fill that out. Secondly, as Rebecca mentioned, it really helps to have a specific office or individual identified who is going to be the designated kind of lead person on the project. Much of the work towards completing these self-assessments that you eventually submit to CoreTrustSeal is writing, is coordination, is documenting processes. And so if there's like a single sort of point of coordination for all of that, that is really helpful, and that's what we're going to be looking for there. Evidence that the repository serves its designated community is the third scoring criteria. And we've left this kind of loose for now. We just want to know what you're doing to serve your designated community. And then finally, a clearly articulated rationale for achieving CoreTrustSeal certification. So Reina has discussed some of the benefits that she saw for ONC there, and mentioned the paper by Lindlar and Schwab that talks about some of the incentives and benefits of achieving certification. So we're looking here for how is this going to, how do you see this benefiting your repository in particular? What is your repository seeking to gain through certification? So we just want to know that you've thought that through basically, and articulate that in the application. And as I mentioned, we have some additional considerations. If we need to move to these at the end of the evaluation process, by we I mean the selection committee, we will consider regional distribution, disciplinary coverage, and including repositories that have previously achieved certification. And that is the basic gist of our call for applications. And I really hope we get a ton of response, and I look forward to your questions.
Great, thanks so much to all of you. This is a really exciting project. So we do have a few questions that have come up during the course of the presentation. And this is one that was in the chat, and I'm going to do it now so I don't forget to ask it. And this is going back to Rebecca's section. The cohorts listed appear to have had some discipline or knowledge space commonality. Was that important for the cohort to work?
It was actually more important to how the funding was set up. But I do think that it is helpful to have similar domains if you're in a cohort to work together. You have more in common, and you might have similar processes for your repository. It's not necessary, but the funding dictated it, and it seemed to work well for us.
Great, thank you. So I've got a two-part question here from James Dwaron. So we'll do the first part first. Are individual institutional dataverses eligible for this funding supported call? So would that meet the designated community requirement? Realizing there are other details, re-understanding of the community, as well as ongoing work regarding monitoring.
So this is a really good question, and I'm going to call on our director, Jeff Moon, and service coordinator, Emily Wilson, to help me with this one, as they would like to do. The short answer is we definitely want your application. Yes, we would be happy to have institutional repositories that are using Dataverse as part of the cohort. And I'm going to let Jeff and Lee say what they would like.
Hi there, just juggling my mouse and my screens a bit there. Our goal with this call is to really go through a learning process, and it's going to be a reciprocal learning process. And so that a repository not meets 100% the requirements, the hard requirements of CoreTrustSeal certification is not, in my mind, a prerequisite to this call. And so part of this is the designated community requirement, and I think that there's a way of interpreting that to include a campus. If you have an institutional repository, that your campus could be your designated community, as diverse as the disciplines represented there might be. And I think that we would very much like to see, in the second part of your question, representatives who are dataverses within the Scholars Portal Dataverse world participate. There is work, and I think Raina could perhaps speak to this a bit more. There's work happening to see sort of a back-end technical certification process for something like Scholars Portal Dataverse running the back end, and then for people who are availing themselves of that service themselves becoming certified based on the work and effort that they're putting in as participants within a larger Dataverse operation. So our goal again is to open this up as broadly as possible and try and learn together where the gaps are and move the needle forward on certification for repositories in Canada. I'm not sure if Raina wanted to weigh in a little bit on the sort of the duality of the technical versus the repository support or certification.
Yeah, and then I mean, we can step into whatever he wanted to say here, but like I did briefly mention, there is a recognition at the CoreTrustSeal that there needs to be sort of a wider scope of opportunity for generalist repositories and technical service providers. Historically, it's been more focused on, the disciplinary observatories, but even there has been a number of repositories that are certified that are a little bit more broad in terms of like they have numerous sub-communities or disciplines that they serve, and they just have to articulate that. But definitely, like this is something that the CoreTrustSeal is coming to terms with in terms of how to kind of represent the different parts of the ecosystem in the certification, and not necessarily exclude anyone, but basically, certify institutions or repositories for what they are, and trying to do it that way. And so everyone is, I guess, learning through this process.
Yeah, that was all very well said. And just to add that to the second part of your question, for this cohort, Scholars Portal has representation on the DREG, and we expect that they're going to be very closely involved with this project and the cohort as it goes forward, even if, there isn't yet sort of a separate track for technical repository service providers just yet, although that's something that's being looked at CoreTrustSeal. So we expect that they're going to be closely involved with this, in addition to working directly with any of its member institutions that do decide to apply as the repository service.
Great, thank you for that. I see that Karine is typing an answer to this question, but I think I'll ask it out loud anyway, because there's probably lots of people who want to know. How many repositories in total are you expecting to have in the cohort?
We are looking at 8 to 10 repositories in the cohort, but we are open to having more repositories than that participate in cohort activities. We don't have funding for more than that, but if people are interested in participating, we don't want to close it off. So get in touch.
Great, thank you. And this is an interesting question, which I guess would go to maybe some of the selection of who would be accepted. Much like predatory journals, are there predatory data repositories?
I don't know how many of you have been monitoring the sort of the channels that we're all tuned into for the repository criteria that count or something like that. And it was basically a list of the major publishers, journal publishers, who laid out a range of criteria. And the Coalition of Open Access Repositories, or CORE internationally, and Portage here in Canada published responses to that article. And the concerns that were expressed surrounded the notion of publishers in effect in the driver's seat dictating terms for what makes a good repository, which would in effect drive traffic to journal approved, journal endorsed repositories, as opposed to other repositories that may be legitimate within a discipline and may themselves be worthy and recognized repositories. So that there are predatory or there aren't predatory repositories out there, I'm not going to point fingers, but I suspect that there are concerns in that space. Anybody else want to weigh in on that? I suppose not.
I think we've given enough space that another question sort of along these same lines. Are there any formalized relationships between publishers such as Canadian Science Publications and Canadian data repositories? And if no one knows, that's okay too.
I'm not sure.
I don't know of any in Canada.
Okay. Any further questions? We have a question about how formal the relationships are. I think maybe this is probably a question for another webinar, but definitely some interesting thoughts coming up here about how the relationships between repositories and publishers work. Yeah, I think question about endorsement by funders. I'm guessing that's endorsement of repositories by funders, probably.
Yeah, I'd interpret it that way. You will find in the soon to be released by agency funder policy and the latest that we've heard, and we've all learned not to hold our breath, but the latest I've heard is early March. The policy, as I understand it, is going to speak to recognized repositories, full stop. So I think this funding opportunity and the cohort going through this will be providing that level of community endorsement, if you will, or international recognition and endorsement for the repositories that are available to Canadian researchers. My impression is that the funders are going to generally shy away from particular recommendations. They've certainly supported Portage efforts to train and bring people up to speed on research data management and appropriate planning and ultimate deposit, but they are perhaps wisely shying away from recommending one repository over another.
And I'll just add, I think that kind of makes sense though as an initial stepping stone, because this is a big leap just to have this policy out when it comes. And there would maybe need time to maybe mature it to maybe requiring certification or something like that. But certainly we see funding agencies in other countries and regions going the route of requiring certification or moving their repositories towards certification to support that kind of notion. But I don't know the long term of Canada.
And it's quite a ways off. I mean, my understanding is if the policy were to drop in March of this year, the first requirement for institutional research data management strategy would be a full 2 years out before it became a hard requirement for funding. And then data management plans would follow sometime after or possibly coincident with that, but still quite a ways out. And then ultimately deposit into these repositories, recognized repositories. We're probably looking at 2.5 years plus.
Great, thanks very much for that. So I'm not seeing any further questions, so I will say that if you do have questions, please direct them to Portage, and we will, Karine and our expert team will get in touch with you. I will be sending out the slides for this webinar to everyone who's registered, so hopefully a lot of your questions will be answered there. My wonderful co-hosts have just put our links to our survey in the chat, so if you have any questions about that, or any comments on the webinar, we would love to hear those. And our next webinars coming up are going to be part of the Persistent Identifiers series, which I'm just going to plop a link in the chat for now. And we hope to see you all at those. So hopefully you have all now been inspired to submit to this funding opportunity. We hope to get a lot of responses, a lot of excellent responses, as we move things forward in the Canadian repository community. Thanks so much to our speakers, Karine and Raina and Rebecca, and to Jeff and Lee as well. Have a great rest of your Wednesday, and we will see you all soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.